I am Curran Bhatia. I am speaking to one of the most accomplished boxing historians, boxing authors of our time, and that is Thomas Hauser. So, Thomas, we just came off of Anthony Joshua's win in the rematch against Andy Ruiz. We know he got knocked out the first time Anthony Joshua did, and he was able to come back with a much more technical style, work behind the jab. So I just wanted to get your initial impressions. What did you think of this version of Anthony Joshua?
Anthony did what he had to do to win this particular fight. My sense is that this style would not work against somebody like Deontay Wilder or Tyson Fury. It worked against Andy Ruiz because Andy was always slow and plodding, and this time he was slower and more plodding, and obviously grossly out of shape. Against somebody like Tyson Fury, who's a very accomplished boxer, also very, very large, bigger than Anthony, the style wouldn't work. And you can't fight Deontay Wilder like this, because if you fight Deontay like this, eventually he'll bang you with a big right hand. So, if Anthony were to take either of those fights, he'd have to find something new in his toolbox to fight them with. But my sense is that he's not going to fight any of them time in the near future. He's talked about fighting Kubrat Pulev, who's a fairly slow, plodding opponent, and Alexander Usyk, who's a very accomplished boxer, but not a big puncher, certainly not Anthony's size. But look, Anthony did what he had to do. As Georgie Benton famously said, win this one, look good next time.
And he was able to do that. He was able to get the win, but it wasn't the most appealing performance for a fan. As fans, of course, we're always looking for the knockout, especially in the heavyweight division. Let me ask you this. After the fight, Ruiz came out and said he didn't train as hard as he could. We knew that because he actually ballooned up in weight. He came in at 283 pounds. He usually comes in around 250, 260. Part of that was because he was becoming the heavyweight champion for the first time. He ended up buying a new house and cars and partying, and he didn't take it as seriously as he could. Those are his own words. So how much credit do you give to AJ for doing what he did, or do you say that Ruiz actually didn't really show up in the way that he could have?
Ruiz never trains as hard as he should. That's one of the reasons Top Rank let Andy buy his way out of his contract. Part of being a fighter is the preparation for the fight. It would be ridiculous to say that a fighter just gets into the ring and fights. There are months and months of hard physical work, preparation that go into getting ready for a fight. There's lots of study. You really have to look at it not just from the point of view of getting your body in shape physically, but mapping out a strategy, a game plan. Anthony's a professional. He did what he had to do to get ready for this fight, and Andy didn't. So, but what happened.
And we look ahead, as you said, Joshua will have a couple mandatories here. Pulev has been mentioned. Usyk has been mentioned. It's not what we want to see as fight fans, because we know that we have Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury, hopefully in February of 2020, and we'd all love to see the winner of that fight take on Anthony Joshua. Now, let me ask you this, something that you spoke about earlier.
Let me just interject to say, sure, I'd like to see the winner of that fight take on Anthony Joshua, or I'd like to see the loser of that fight take on Anthony Joshua. Either one of those fights would be massive, and my understanding is that once Wilder Fury 2 happens, there doesn't have to be an immediate rematch. Either or both guys can have one interim fight in between. So would I like to see Anthony fight one of those two guys? Sure, but I don't think he will.
It doesn't seem like he will, especially with the plans that he's talked about for the next year. It didn't seem that way with his post-fight comments, with Eddie Hearn's post-fight comments. It didn't seem like the winner or loser of that fight would necessarily be in their immediate plans. But just hypothetically here, let's say that Wilder and Joshua did come together. I just wanted to ask you about something you mentioned earlier. we knew that Wilder had trouble finding Tyson Fury in their fight, and that's because Fury has that style where he moves around a lot. Now, me watching Joshua's most recent performance, I say he's moving around a lot, he's working behind the jab, he's fighting in a more technical style, and that makes me think that maybe Wilder would have trouble trying to find that right hand. What do you make of that in terms of Joshua moving more if he was to fight Wilder?
Well, two things. Number one, Tyson Fury, despite his size and the fact that he looks very clumsy at times in the ring, is probably more elusive than Anthony Joshua. And second, Tyson Fury appears to have a much better chin than Anthony Joshua.
So let's see what happens if that mythical matchup ever does come together. And like you said, even the loser of that fight fighting Joshua would be great. So I wanted to ask you, when we first spoke a while back, you mentioned that Anthony Joshua was being marketed as a rock star, which he definitely was. I'm curious to where do you place him now in history? We knew that he was the undefeated champion. He suffered the loss and he was able to avenge it. And that's obviously happened to other heavyweight champions in history. So in your mind, do you see him still on that path of becoming a great heavyweight, maybe one of the top heavyweights of this era based on this most recent performance?
The bloom has come off the rose of Anthony Joshua. This was a very nice win for him and an essential win for him. And could he become a great heavyweight champion? Yes, but he'll have to prove it in the ring. To my way of thinking, none of the claimants to the heavyweight throne right now have proven themselves as great. So let's see what happens. Now, if Deontay Wilder decisively beats Tyson Fury and then decisively beats Anthony Joshua, then you'd look at him and you'd say, okay, he might be great. On the other hand, if Tyson Fury dominates Wilder in a rematch and beats Joshua, you'd give him credit. And if Anthony comes back and were to beat Fury and Wilder, you'd say, okay, yeah, this guy is great. It was a blip against Andy Ruiz. You don't know. We don't really know what Anthony Joshua is. There are all sorts of hints now coming from the Joshua camp that, well, you don't know. Anthony had medical issues, I think they're referred to, or other problems before the first Ruiz fight. But you have to balance that off against the fact that if it was simply a question of Anthony not being physically right that night, he wouldn't have needed to go out and lose 10 pounds and completely retool his boxing style to fight Ruiz. So again, there are a lot of questions here. One of the problems we have today in boxing, and it's not just the heavyweights, is that fighters are acclaimed as great by press release. In the old days, you had to beat great fighters to be considered great, and fighting great fighters made you better. Sugar Ray Leonard lost to Roberto Duran, but he took what he learned in that loss to Duran, came back and beat Duran in the rematch. And then he took what he learned in that fight and came back to beat Thomas Hearns. And he took what he learned from that fight and brought it to the ring to beat Marvin Hagler. By and large, the great fighters are not fighting each other. And we can see that by virtue of the fact that Terence Crawford is fighting this weekend at Madison Square Garden. We don't know how good Terence Crawford is because the elite opponents haven't been there for him to fight. My sense is that Terence really wanted to fight Errol Spence. My sense is that Errol didn't really want to fight Terence. Right now, Bob Arum would seem to want that fight. But again, we don't know how badly hurt Errol was in that car accident. You know, on the one hand, we hear, oh, he's recovered, he wasn't badly hurt, but I haven't heard any reports yet of, oh, Errol looks great in the gym. So one of the biggest problems boxing has today is that the elite fighters aren't fighting each other. I like the fact that Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury are getting in the ring to fight each other. I'd like to see Anthony Joshua get into that mix. I'm hoping Jarrell Miller, who would be a difficult opponent, in my view, for Wilder or Joshua, gets his act together and gets into the mix. My sense is that, Fury would probably outbox Jarrell fairly easily, but Jarrell, because of his size, his ability to take a punch, and the inexorable nature of his attack, would ask some very interesting questions of Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua. Let's see the best fight each other, not just once every 2 years, but on a regular basis.
That's a big problem with our sport, how fragmented it is, not just with promoters, but also with networks. And it seems like there's more platforms than ever now. And getting these, and also with the sanctioning bodies having different mandatories, and that we see that happening with Anthony Joshua right now. Let's hope that that gets resolved. So just to close it out, Thomas, I know that we're getting to the end of the decade here. It's the last month. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if you look at kind of this last decade in terms of boxing, you've covered it for a long time. Where does it rank in terms of the last 10 years and any extremely memorable moments that stuck out to you?
Well, the question I'm asking myself now is who should be the fighter of the decade? And nobody has really stood out in this decade like some fighters did in previous decades. In other words, in the previous decade, you had Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather, and I gave the nod to Manny. In the 1990s, you had Roy Jones. In the 80s, you had Sugar Ray Leonard. In the 70s, Roberto Duran. In the 60s, Muhammad Ali. Before that, there's Rocky Marciano, Sugar Ray Robinson, Henry Armstrong, Dempsey and Tunney, Jack Johnson. You can go back and back and back. And there were always one or more fighters who stood out as being deserving of fighter of the decade. Because the best haven't fought the best in the last decade, by and large, it's harder to make that decision. My personal choice would be Canelo Alvarez. Canelo has always been willing to go in tough. He lost once. As a young fighter without experience, he lost to Floyd Mayweather. But he has beaten some very formidable opponents, and he's been willing to fight the tough fights. He fights guys like Erislandy Lara and Austin Trout, who people didn't want to fight. He fought Golovkin twice. He fought Kovalev. He fought Cotto. Again, nobody stands out in this decade like in past decades. But if you look at the other people who you might consider beyond honor, Andre Ward, great fighter, but his biggest victories in the Super 6 tournament were in the previous decade. Vladimir Klitschko, biggest victories in the previous decade. Floyd Mayweather, really not that much on his resume for this decade. Gennady Golovkin didn't really beat elite fighters in this decade. Yeah, there's a school of thought that Golovkin beat Canelo in their first encounter, that Canelo won the rematch, and Canelo has more in addition to those two fights on his resume. So for me, it's a close call, but I think Canelo Alvarez should be the fighter of the decade.
It's certainly a good pick, and obviously what Canelo's been able to do, transcending different weight classes and having success at different weights, and obviously having the win over Golovkin is a great feather in his cap as well. So just to close it out, last question for you. We talked about the previous decade. Looking ahead now into 2020, what is the matchup that you'd like to see most? We talked about Joshua hopefully fighting the Fury Wilder winner and or loser. We talked about Spence versus Crawford. Who knows what Spence's condition is now, if that fight will ever happen. Canelo Triple G was mentioned. So if you had a couple matchups or fights that you were particularly looking forward to in 2020, what would those be?
There are lots of good fights that could be made. I'd love to see Basilone against Gervonta Davis, for example. Do I think that will happen? No, it won't. But that would be a wonderful fight. There are other very, very good fights that could be made. But one of the things that disappoints me most about the infusion of huge amounts of money into the system in the last year, because you have DAZN, ESPN, Fox, all pouring unprecedented amounts of money into the system, is in the old days, the big money was used to make the big fights. Now the big money is being used to keep the big fights from happening.
it is unfortunate that the big fights aren't happening the way they should, and let's hope that we get those matchups in the next decade. Thomas Hauser, thank you so much for the time. I know your latest book, A Dangerous Journey Inside Another Year in Boxing, is out right now. I highly recommend everyone to check that out. Thomas, thank you so much for your time and expertise in helping place this Joshua Ruiz rematch in history for us.
Thank you for having me.